Right now, the United States is no longer treating pharmaceuticals as just another trade issue. On April 2, 2026, the White House issued a proclamation titled, "Adjusting Imports of Pharmaceuticals and Pharmaceutical Ingredients into the United States." The message is clear. This is now being treated as a national security matter, and the administration is using trade policy to deal with it. The scale of the dependence is the real story. According to the White House, about 53% of patented pharmaceutical products distributed in the United States are produced outside the country, and only 15% of patented active pharmaceutical ingredients, or APIs, are produced domestically for the U.S. market. That is not just reliance on imports. That is a structural vulnerability. What makes this even more important is the shift in policy direction. For years, the United States made pharmaceutical trade easier and cheaper. U.S. ITC data show that after the WTO pharmaceutical tariff agreement took effect in 1995, U.S. imports of pharmaceutical goods rose from $8.6 billion in 1996 to more than $113 billion in 2016. In other words, the country spent decades moving toward global sourcing. Now it is trying to move back in the other direction. The White House says the current import structure threatens not only national security but also the economy. The reasoning is straightforward. If a country depends heavily on foreign supply for critical medicines and inputs, any geopolitical shock, trade dispute, or supply chain disruption can quickly turn into a healthcare problem at home. That is the core risk behind the policy. The new policy is aggressive. It imposes a 100% ad valorem duty on patented pharmaceutical products and related ingredients. For companies with approved onshoring plans, the rate starts at 20% and then rises to 100% on April 2, 2030. At the same time, there are exceptions for some categories such as orphan drugs, nuclear medicines, fertility treatments, cell and gene therapies, antibody-drug conjugates, and other specialty products. Generic drugs and biosimilars are not being adjusted at this time. There are also country-specific treatment rules. The proclamation sets a 15% rate for products from Japan, the European Union, South Korea, and Switzerland and Liechtenstein jointly. The United Kingdom gets a 10% rate, which can be reduced to zero under a future pharmaceutical pricing agreement. For companies that have executed or are close to executing MFN pricing and onshoring agreements, the tariff rate can be zero until January 20, 2029. The timing matters. The proclamation says the tariff structure applies immediately through the legal framework it establishes, with company-specific treatment and phased increases built into the plan. That means firms are not being asked to react to a vague political warning. They are being asked to make investment and supply chain decisions under a very specific tariff schedule. That alone changes corporate behavior. The broader trade backdrop shows why the issue is so large. U.S. Census data show that total U.S. imports of goods increased by $187.1 billion to $3.2956 trillion in 2024. Within that, pharmaceutical preparations rose by $43.6 billion, which is a huge year-over-year jump for a single consumer goods category. This does not mean all of that trade is subject to the new tariffs, but it does show how central pharmaceuticals have become in the U.S. import picture. So what does this mean economically? A 100% tariff is not a fine-tuning tool. It is a forceful price signal. The government is telling companies, either build more capacity in the United States or pay a very large penalty for importing. In theory, that can push reshoring. In practice, factories, supply chains, regulatory approvals, and skilled labor do not appear overnight. That delay is the biggest uncertainty in the whole policy. In the short run, the most likely effect is higher costs for firms that depend on imported patented medicines or APIs. If those costs move down the chain, they can eventually affect insurers, pharmacies, and consumers. That is not a direct quote from the proclamation. It is the economic implication of a steep import duty imposed on a highly globalized input chain. There is also a second-order effect. Once a tariff schedule becomes this steep, companies do not just ask, "Where should we buy?" They ask, "Where should we build?" That changes the geography of investment, the logic of sourcing, and the bargaining power between governments and multinational drug makers. That is where the policy becomes bigger than a trade measure. The likely winners are companies that already have meaningful U.S. production, or those able to qualify for lower rates through approved onshoring plans and MFN pricing agreements. The proclamation explicitly creates preferential treatment for firms that commit to production in the United States. That means the policy is not just punitive, it is also selective and incentive-driven. The likely losers are firms that remain heavily dependent on imported patented drugs and API chains. Some may absorb part of the cost, but many will probably try to pass it on or restructure their supply base. The exact outcome will vary by product, but the basic pressure point is obvious. The tariff raises the cost of staying dependent on foreign supply. Another important point is that the policy does not fully close the door on foreign sourcing. It creates a hierarchy: 0, 10%, 15%, 20%, and 100% depending on the product, the country, and the company's investment commitments. That is a more sophisticated tool than a flat ban, but it also makes the system more complex and more expensive to navigate. So the real story here is not just that tariffs are being imposed. It is that the United States is starting to treat pharmaceuticals the way it treats other strategic sectors, as a national security asset that should not depend too heavily on foreign supply. The White House is explicitly arguing that domestic manufacturing capacity is vital for military readiness, public health, and crisis resilience. But that logic comes with a trade-off. The more aggressively the U.S. pushes for domestic production, the more likely it is that the transition period will be costly. That is the central tension in the policy. It may reduce long-term vulnerability, but in the near term it can also raise prices, squeeze margins, and create adjustment pain across the healthcare system. The best-case scenario is that the tariffs force real investment, real capacity, and a more resilient supply chain inside the United States. The worst-case scenario is that they mainly increase costs while leaving the dependence problem only partially solved. That is why this policy matters far beyond the pharmaceutical industry. It touches inflation, investment, trade, and the future shape of American industrial policy.